basically, last 2 years we are talking about. So
Yeah.
we lost 2 years of our lives. Gone to the...
At least two years of office life. I mean, I can cope with a lot of isolation and mostly motivate myself. But I don't think that's the norm for people, that they can cope with that amount of just getting yourself into motion every day, and just plow on. It takes a certain hermit mentality that I happen to have, but it's not in our contract that we should be able to live for years in this way. So it's, yeah.
So like my plan is to, like, obviously, you're my longtime friend, comrade, everything, and also, I have got so much respect for you, Anja. I mean, you don't know. I mean,
thank you.
You are such a big scholar, big scholar. I think with this podcast, perhaps we'll get some of the other things from you, and that will be interesting for my audience, and also people can get inspired from these stories. So like we just talk, whatever comes. There's no so we'll just see like how it goes. So I mean, one of the like obligatory question I ask always to my guest is like, where were you born and raised?
Well, I was born and raised in Copenhagen, grew up in sort of the industrial south of Copenhagen. It was supposed to be the industrial hub of Copenhagen, where a lot of people from the inner cities, when much of the slum was knocked down, they were sort of encouraged to move out there. But there were also a lot of people like my parents who moved out because it was relatively cheap for working class people to move out and get a piece of land and build a house. That was the thing to do in the 1960s and 70s. So sometimes people, when they hear where I grew up, they say that people are not living there. So, well, they are. Some people are living there. My parents still live there. So it was sort of a rather drab place to grow up. But I've reconciled myself with it because, people actually made a living there. It was full of small businesses. It wasn't pretty, but it was economically viable. And then I went to school in central Copenhagen, and that was much more fun for me because it was right in the center of town, and right next to my school was a lane where they used to have antiquarian book stores. So I spent a lot of time with my nose in the antiquarian books. And when it got a bit too cold and I was running around, there was the Copenhagen Central Library, which was just very close. So that I also spent a lot of time between the books in the Central Library. In those days, I think children and teenagers, they just roamed freely to an extent that we probably wouldn't really see today.
So like, I mean, how often do you go back to those places?
About once or twice a year. But I've been away from Denmark for 30 years, so it's not really my city anymore or my society. It's changed a lot. That's just how things work. I've become more sort of a Europe trotter.
Because I mean, the people who are like not in UK but live in, places like, Scandinavia or like Nordic countries, and like mainland Europe, they travel quite a lot, because also like traveling is easier there. Lots of good train connection, cheaper as well.
Yeah.
I mean, each time I go to like, any of the European countries, I try to travel in other places as well. I was in Berlin, then ended up going to like Prague.
Yeah.
Pretty easy. I mean, so same with, I think Denmark can be very, seamless to go to like other countries like this, like Norway or Sweden.
But the whole opening of Europe is also very much part of my own experience as a young person, because when I started traveling around in Europe as an 18-year-old, there was still a lot of border control. There was still a lot of different currencies in each country, and it was still the Cold War. So there were limits to where we could go, and Denmark is very close to where the Iron Curtain starts in the north, and it was just inside our heads. We couldn't go there. So as a young person, when we got the Interrail card, that was the thing in those days, to buy a train ticket for 1 month that you could use for all public trains across Europe.
Oh my God.
But across Europe, that was Western Europe. So I did that 3 times. You had to be 18 to get a ticket.
Okay.
I turned 18 on the 2nd of July, and I went on Interrail on the 3rd. It was the thing to do. It was fantastic. And then came the end of the Cold War, and the opening of the Iron Curtain, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And for people of my generation, I mean, it was the absolute greatest thing, to be able to go there, to speak to people. You have to bear in mind, I grew up with, when we came with a ferry from Denmark to Travemünde in Germany, in West Germany, we could see East Germany. We could see the beaches. We could see the people on the beaches in East Germany. And then there was this enormous fence going out in the Baltic Sea to prevent people from swimming around. And it meant that I knew over there are people, I can actually speak to them because I spoke German. I would be able to speak to them, but they live in a different world. I can never get over there. We can never meet. We can never have a conversation. And that shaped my sensibilities of Europe. So when it all came down and suddenly we could go there, it was just fantastic. So my travels in Europe, it just got more and more open, and I guess that made me very much a European. There are all kinds of problems with the European community, but it's better than what we had, and I really don't want to go back. I always want to talk to people. I always want to engage. So that was a very important part of my youth experience.
Like one thing you mentioned that you can speak German as well. Is it like quite common to actually speak German?
Well, most Danes speak Danish and English, but it's not uncommon for people with small languages that once you start learning one language, then you learn others. And also as a Scandinavian speaker, you start out with having 3 languages in a sense, because Swedish and Norwegian are very closely connected. So we instantly understand Swedish and Norwegian. German, it's different, but it's still quite easily understandable. So it's closely related, and you sort of get used to just picking up things that are not that dissimilar from your own language, and you start from a very early age, because it's just at 200 kilometers south they start speaking German. At 20 kilometers to the east they speak Swedish, and the television speaks Swedish and English and German all the time. So it's sort of, you're just used to it.
It's quite common, because I mean, I grew up in Bangladesh, and our next door is India and a couple of other countries in the near proximity, and we actually understand somehow, like the way they talk, the things they say. And part of the game is, there's lots of TV show, lots of radio programs and all those things. So you just like grew up, and then you just learn in a kind of natural process. And I think that the proximity, geographic proximity, is really, really important. And like that's one of the things I think the British Isle, since it's kind of separated, and that I think, I mean, whenever I talk to any European students, I mean, they always have, 2-3 languages, very common. But here it's very, very uncommon to know, some other languages, very like proficient. It's very, very rare. Do you think that's a like good way to see it? Like, I mean, how?
Yeah, and I guess people in the UK, and I guess it's the same for US, are just not exposed to situations where they have to change language. Of course, they live in countries where there are a lot of languages spoken around them, both in the UK and in the US. But it's different because whenever you have to communicate with someone, they turn to English, whether they're tourists or whether they're just people living in minority, with minority languages. For me, and perhaps you have the same experience, although Bengali it's after all a major language in both Bangladesh and Northwest India. The experience for me and for a lot of Europeans is that whenever you meet someone who is not from your own country, you have to change language, because they're not going to start speaking Danish.
Yeah.
And you learn that from the age of 3, basically. You hear grown-ups around you switching language ever so often. So it sort of just becomes a part of what you think. Well, when you're a child, you speak Danish only, and when you grow up, you speak more languages. It's a completely different way of
because the problem is, like, I mean, once you grown up, like 18, 20, then it's difficult to, learn another language, because it has to be the process from the very, early years of your lives. I mean, for me, like, because I mean, English is not like part and parcel of my life. So I started English like later. So like, even like today, after living in the West for almost 25 years, I still struggle. I still check grammar. I still, I get worried that, that my colleagues will, think that I'm really stupid. My language is really poor.
No.
I mean, this actually happened a couple of years ago. I mean, I'm not going to more details on this. Like, one of the colleagues, I don't know like what kind of situation was that for him or her, but I mean, this person always picked up my grammar, always, so like trying to correct my grammar in my emails. So that created some kind of like, even like PTSD. I always like worried about, sending any emails to anyone. So I have to read it quite a lot, a couple of times, and the check, okay, it makes sense. So it's like, it's a kind of trauma. So that did not help. That really did not help. But I think that language is like more, I don't know, it's like guest host relationship, isn't it? This has to be very kind from the both sides.
Yeah. And I guess that sometimes people do correct out of the best intentions. But I think it's also, we're both speaking English as foreign speakers, but it's not a level playing field, because your journey towards English was so much further than mine. Because although English speakers roll their eyes and think that Scandinavian sounds really weird and foreign, actually it is, together with Dutch, the closest you can get to English. It's very, very close. Even the way we conjugate irregular verbs are the same. So for Danes to start speaking English is, a small journey, just as it's a small journey to learn German. It's just a journey in a different direction. Whereas for you, it's just completely different. It's even a different script. It's much.
It's like quantum leap. So like when, like all those immigration policies. I mean, sometimes I feel that these policies are very oppressive. It's like kind of micro violence against the other people. So basically, you are told that, oh, you have to learn this language, man, in next 3 months. And then, you have to sit for a test as well. I mean, it's a kind of, like language hierarchy, isn't it?
Yeah.
Someone is on the top, and then, this is your job to learn my language, not my job to learn your language.
No, but sometimes if English speakers would just learn their own language, that might be a good idea, because I guess that's where, as a foreign speaker, because we have to learn it the hard way, we have to learn the grammar, we have to learn to do it correctly. Then I guess we are also the ones who can pick on English speakers who don't. Yeah. And it's a field, I guess. You have to approach it, as you say, with great gentleness and care. But because my mother tongue is so much closer to English than yours, and because in my primary school, God, we did languages, and that was the main thing we did. So we did English, we did German, French, Latin. Latin is very, very useful. And that means that there are a lot of words, even in Greek, I did that as well, that I can actually spell, whereas they're tricky in English because they look weird, but if you know Greek or Latin, it sort of makes sense. And there are a lot of details of grammar which are pretty logic when you've been through 5 different European languages and you know where it comes from and how it developed, but which don't make much sense in English. So it's very, very weird, but there's certain, I make a lot of errors in English, but there are also certain errors I never make. I have no problem about saying etc. instead of etc., which is wrong. I can spell the word February because it's sort of obvious. It's not obvious to native speakers. So I guess when people are being snooty to me, I'm just being snooty back.
I mean, because I'm quite linked with this like British colonial history. Like one of the things like British rule did in India and the subcontinent, if they did not like any of the names, what they did, they changed the name arbitrarily, basically. So I will call you this because that name is a bit difficult for me. I'll just kind of make it like more easy so that I can pronounce. So there is like power relations, isn't it, with the like language, who controls the whole process, and the powerful always wins. One of the things like Bangladesh did when it got some kind of, so Bangladesh had to go through like two independent movement, two independence. So one is from the Britain first, and then from Pakistan. So when like Pakistan became part of like us, Pakistan thought that, yeah, how about we'll make the national language actually the Pakistan language they speak, which is Urdu. and that created a serious problem. And then people said, no, this is my language. What do you mean by that? And so like we had to fight another fight. This is like mini fight before the main fight. So you can see like straight away it goes to those like, aggressive mode, the who will control what. Which doesn't make any sense to me. Like why we do it? Why this thing happens again and again throughout our history?
But I guess that people coming from cultures that are used to being the top dog often don't quite realize the extent to which they have advantage, and don't realize when they're actually imposing their advantages on others. I guess that's part of the whole thing about privilege that we've also discussed, of even being aware that one has advantages. Necessarily think about it.
Because I really want to know, like those childhood memories, because those are very special memories. How did you think, like your parents, in those earliest days of your lives, shaped your understanding about the bigger picture, the world, those kind of things?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think either of my parents had sort of very clear ideas of shaping a bigger picture in the kind of working class setting I grew up with. It wasn't really it wasn't really something that people got much involved in. People just tried to, get through life the best they could. And I guess that attitude shaped a lot of people who I knew at the time. But at the same time, on my mother's side, there were a lot of interesting people who had some broader visions. Partly in my mother's family, it was because they were very committed Lutherans. So I was brought up by my mother as a Lutheran, with a sort of very clear Christian understanding, not so much of life, but more of history and the past, and very, very tied to the Hebrew Bible. So it sort of gave a kind of long-term perspective back in time that had nothing to do with our history, but was religiously based. So that was a very strong vision, but of course a vision that had influenced Danish culture over many centuries. And although I have absolutely no religious beliefs as a grown-up, being religiously literate, knowing what they're talking about, and knowing the stories that shaped Christianity has been very useful. It has been very useful as a historian, because obviously so much of European history was linked to that. So I sort of grew up with very much a local Danish vision that was quite, I hesitate to say closed, but inevitably, when you have a small language and you're part of small culture, it sort of becomes very self-referential. And although Danishness doesn't exist in isolation, it's part of a Scandinavian culture. You're still very much locked into your language. That's another motivation for trying to learn other languages, learning big languages, so that you can somehow acquire the world. So it was sort of a vision of not so much of being workers, because my parents didn't have any identity as workers, but as being Danish. And then this traditionalist Lutheran Christian understanding of the world and our position in it. And I can still see how that, in a more secular version, shapes the emerging right and far right in Danish politics. It's I can see what they're getting at. I know where they're coming from. It's uncomfortable, but I can see where they're coming from. But they're very secular. They refer to Christianity and to Lutheranism as a kind of as a way of positioning themselves as non-Muslim, as Danish different from these Muslims coming in, because that's obviously what that Danishness is about. But it's not a Christianity in a way that is recognizable to people who actually have Christian beliefs. It's sort of the shorthand of tradition. But I think that was sort of the main vision. And then my parents traveled a lot, brought me and my brother with them, traveled a lot within Europe, within Western Europe, where we could go. So I had a clear sense of at least the German-speaking world. We didn't go much to France because we didn't speak French, but then when I learned to speak French, I acquired that part of it. So that was yet another sort of gaining access to a new world, the Francophone world, which is different from the English-speaking world or the German-speaking world.
That's fascinating story. I mean, like, one of the things I really want to ask here, I mean, if you don't feel comfortable, you don't have to answer this. The question will be like, I mean, when you say like your parents are from a working class background, like the Danish working class, like what kind of industry they were involved in?
Okay. First of all, I should say that industrialization only really hit Denmark in the beginning by the 1870s and really taking off in the 1990s. So all my ancestors on all sides, they were small farmers. They were peasants until my great-grandparents all moved to Copenhagen from various parts of eastern Denmark. All moved to Copenhagen in the 1880s and 1890s in search of work, and therefore moved from being farmers to being industrial workers. But unlike the British working class, I know I'm saying something very, very general here, if there's such a thing as the British working class, but the industrial workers in Denmark were always had strong roots in rural, in a rural reality. One very obvious example is that it's very typical for houses here in Dundee, working class housing, to have been built in the 19th century without a kitchen. There's only a scullery.
Yep.
The kitchens were put in later. And that would have been absolutely inconceivable in a Danish context, because workers, they were used to cooking at home, and also have an allotment somewhere, grow your own vegetables, or go back to the family in the village and bring some potatoes back, or whatever they did. But you could not imagine living in, no matter how humble your dwelling was. It might not have a loo, but it had a kitchen. Yeah. So there was this sort of one or two generations, and my family story is very, very typical for Danes, of people coming in from the countryside, and then they were typically factory workers. Denmark doesn't have any mining, so that simply wasn't a thing. Typically factory workers, or those who were lucky might have some kind of artisan skills, so working in smaller workshops. And in the case of my great-grandfather, he had a small corner shop, which so was sort of independent. My grandfather then inherited his corner shop. My father was trained as an electrician, but had his own company. So there was also this strand of being independent, self-employed, but still something we would describe as working class. So whereas my mother's family, they were technically, in sociological terms, workers, my paternal grandparents, but they didn't have this the culture of working class at all, because they saw themselves much more in this rural and religious tradition. So there was a sort of disconnect, if we can call it a disconnect, but just a duality between their actual socio-economical position and their self-understanding. And again, very, very typically for many Danish families, the educational level from one generation to the next increased noticeable. So my father left school when he was 15, my mother when she was 16. My brother and I were the first in the family to go to gymnasium, get A-levels, and then move on to university. And everybody in the family since then have got their A-levels, gone to university. So it was just sort of a clear progression. And it this is actually the story of the vast majority of Danish families, of really a noticeable change across the 20th century.
I mean, especially like in this country, especially in the 21st century, what we are saying, the young people coming to the university have their degree, but without any kind of, prospect that, So like when you were growing up, when you were coming to the universities, did you find the future is like more like, doomsday scenario, or do you think that, yeah, I'm doing this thing and I will have a very good, comfortable life? What kind of perception was there?
I didn't have doomsday visions about my professional prospects, but my professional prospects were pretty modest, I would say. I went to university on the assumption that I was going to be a secondary school teacher, a gymnasium teacher, because I had loved to go to school. I loved to be in gymnasium, and I thought this is fun. This is what I want to do. And then I graduated, and I got a job in a gymnasium, and then I realized that I had actually moved on, and the things I had to teach to these 16 to 19-year-olds, it was not really interesting to me at all, and the conditions were also much more difficult than I had thought. So I had walked through my university years and sort of great optimism, this is what I'm going to do, and the world is in front of me. And then I sort of had the great rethink. I should say, when I reached that point, I was 28, because Danish students go through the university system much more slowly than you do in Britain. In those days, to get a degree, that was a study of 6 years rather than 4. And then you came out with something that was perhaps closer to master's, but there wasn't any choice. Everybody had, in order to have a degree, you had to go through all that, and that was actually quite similar to Germany, quite similar to France at the time. It's Britain who's unusual in having such short university programs. And since the system allows you to sort of go through the system in your own pace, that means that a lot of people take their time, get a couple of children while they're university students. I traveled, so it took some time. I had been living in Paris for 2 years before I graduated. But it's one of the advantages about the Danish system, that it may not be the greatest in the world, but it is fantastically well geared traditionally to send students abroad. Go away, learn something, and perhaps come back. So going abroad for a couple of years and graduating at 28 was perfectly normal. So
like you spent as a school teacher for a couple of years?
It was only 1 year. I ended up having this. I think it was somebody went on maternity leave, and I got this job for 10 months. And during these 10 months, I realized, heck, this is just too boring. And I had met someone while I lived in Paris who had he came from a very British middle-class family. And for some reason, he just thought, this can't be true. You really have to continue your studies. And he was very insistent, and I was very reluctant on my side. But once I got to the reality of what it was like to be a secondary school teacher in Denmark, I came back to my good friend and say, well, yeah, actually. The thing was that I didn't have a chance in hell to get a PhD post in Denmark, because I came from the wrong background, had not made the right connections. It's very, I cannot tell you how the system works, but it definitely doesn't work for people like me who had no connections, no entry, no nothing. So Denmark was not, that was a non-starter. But my friend could sort of help me to apply to different places. So I started applying everywhere. And at the same time, I had to be a little bit discreet about it, because it was sort of not seen as acceptable to aim higher, if you see what I mean. So once I was sitting at the school where I worked, in the room where teachers were preparing their classes, and I had an application form for Oxford in the typewriter. And as you know, once you had things in an old-fashioned typewriter, you should not sort of try to take it out suddenly, because you would never get it back into the right place again. So when one of my colleagues, who was of my age, suddenly came in, it was a Saturday, so I hadn't expected anyone to be around. Suddenly she came in, and she looked at this application form for Oxford and she just looked at me going, rolling her eyes, because the idea that anyone would try to move on and go to Oxford, of all places, when you are in a provincial town in Denmark, was just beyond ridiculous. But nevertheless, I was pretty desperate, so I continued, and luckily I got into the European University Institute, which is a postgraduate institution. It's not part of the European Union, but it's sort of part of the wider cultural institutions set up by the European Union countries. And it came with a scholarship from the Danish Ministry of Education. So there was absolutely no question once I got it. That was it. I was off, and it was in Florence of all places. It was one of the most beautiful cities in Europe. So I was off to Florence for 3 years.
Oh my God.
and as someone who, well, at the time French was my main foreign language, because I had studied French. So I proposed a project that required me studying, comparing France and Germany, but writing in English. And English was actually the greater problem, because I had not studied English since I was 16. So I had to, just get on with it. It was a bit of a challenge, but
so, like, I mean, going back to that institute, I actually went there when I was in Florence a couple of years ago. And I know, like, lots of my colleagues actually went to that institute as well. And these colleagues are either from Germany or from other European. It's like, one of those places you go and then you just flourish. And then, so that's absolutely amazing, isn't it? From sitting
it's a very vibrant place to be. And one thing that I think is quite important for me, just getting on with things, was that it was a community where the vast majority of people had to write a PhD dissertation in a language that was not their own. And many of them had to write it in English. And in that situation, I just thought, okay, in the land of the blind, my English is not great, but if the Greeks and the Spaniards and the Russians get into this, then, you know, as a Danish speaker, you have the great advantage that at least your mother tongue is quite close to English. So just get on with it, despite the difficulties of picking up from my school English. I remember when I started writing academic English, my computer told me that I had an average words per sentence of 60, because I was writing in a sort of very typical Germanic tradition where you have endless sentences, and then you build up and you build up and you build up, and then you come to the point in the very last, at the very bottom of this 60-word sentence. So we're used to sort of going straight to the end to see what is the point here. And in order to write in English, I had to learn to completely move around the furniture and be very upfront, saying what I wanted to say at the beginning and then explain afterwards why that was. It was like a crime novel where you start with the first sentence telling who's the murderer. It felt bizarre, but it has advantages, and it means that I just got very conscious of structure in all I wrote, in all paragraphs. Also, I could not afford to have to I could not write, and I still can't, write a text in longhand, just start and go on and on and on. It's not possible. I have to structure very carefully. And at the time, because it took me so long time to write, I wrote everything in paragraphs that were self-contained. So if I had to break up a text, I could take whole paragraphs and move them around without having to rewrite them. And I discovered that was actually a very effective way of working. I still do it, but it grew out of this struggle with English. Yeah.
So, like, I mean, you went to Oxford as well, isn't it?
Yes, I spent a year in Oxford towards the end of my PhD, because my external supervisor was in Oxford at Nuffield College. So he arranged for me to come there as a visiting PhD student. So I had a great year in Oxford, just writing up my PhD. But that was at a time when I was beyond my 3 years. It was the 4th year, and I had applied for some more funding to survive the 4th year. And yes, yeah, that was a great experience.
Can you tell us a bit of your PhD thesis? I mean, what you were writing on?
Right. The original project was a sociological study of the French and German armies, or the officer corps, as a vehicle for social mobility. What fascinated me was that the army was one of the few institutions where men could enter without much educational or even social background and make it in the ranks. The question was, how much did these two institutions in France and in Prussia allow men to move up in the ranks, and at what point would they have to stop, and what did it mean in terms of mass upwards mobilization? Now, that was the original project, and it collapsed within 3 months. It turned out that
that's quite
it wasn't viable once I got into the archives. Well, great crisis. But my supervisors, they were very cool about it and said, well, just go into the archives and see what you can find. And I ended up, I found a series of uncatalogued documents in the French military archives in Vincennes, which were it was documents that had been in the senior commander's office between 1870 and up to the First World War. And I think what must have happened was that when the Germans came rolling in, they panicked and hit everything that had been in the senior military commander's office somewhere, without going through and see what is important, what is not important. They just hit everything. And then the First World War happened right over the heads, and everybody forgot about all these papers. So they were found in the 1960s, and you basically had a whole description of how a regionally based military organization operated. So it was a fantastic source. One of the things that I used it for, was to study military intervention in strikes and demonstrations in this industrial area of Nord-Pas-de-Calais in northern France, and compare it with the Prussian Ruhr area to see what was the role of the army during 44 years of peace, when they were just drilling and not doing much, except that in France they were operating as riot police all the time. And of course that ties into a lot of debates about democratization and what democracy was supposed to mean in terms of policing. Of course, it was supposed to mean that you don't mobilize the army against strikers, except that was what France, under the Third Republic, one of the most liberal, progressive regimes in Europe at the time, certainly the most democratic regime in Europe, that was what they did. Whereas hardcore militaristic Prussia didn't, or did very, very seldom. So there were all kinds of assumptions about what democratization meant that I could show, well, it just doesn't work. All the social theories of modernization, and there's a major interpretation in German history called the Sonderweg that tries to explain all kinds of things in terms of Prussia being socially and politically backwards, and it tries to explain the rise of the Third Reich through all that. And through my dissertation, I was able to show that much of this just didn't work when applied to the use of military troops against civilians.
So I've got my daughter came back from school. So can you give me 30 seconds?
Yes.
Sorry.
How old is she?
So this is the big one. So big daughter is 17 this year.
17. All right.
So she's just finishing her school. So she's fine. She's okay. She's quite independent.
And the young one?
The young one is 14. So she's like more troublemaker. And also there's like sibling rivalry.
Oh.
That's quite intense as well in the house.
Yeah.
So that could be a question for you about your sibling rivalry growing up in Denmark.
Well, I guess that sibling relationships are not particular in Denmark. I guess they are where they are what they are a bit the world around. But I can't say that I have much experience of sibling rivalry because my brother and I, we fought a lot, but we were actually good friends. So
do you think that that's a cultural thing? I mean,
no. I think it depends so much on family dynamics, and I have spoken to friends from all backgrounds and all cultures,
But also, I think you like mentioned about your mother's background. It's like Lutheran, perhaps some of the rigid rules are there as well, just like there.
That's the impression that people often get, or when I come across people who have an impression of Lutheranism from the outside, they often talk a lot about how it's rigid and it's strict. I don't quite know where that idea comes from, but of course Lutheranism has changed a lot since the 16th century. Luther was not exactly liberal, but it wasn't the most strict form of Protestantism. But then, of course, it also developed over centuries. And because Lutheranism, unlike Catholicism, where you've got you've got a doctrinal center that is applied, albeit in different ways across the world. There is no doctrinal core in Lutheranism. There's no authority to tell either local churches, they are nationally organized, so there's no authority to tell the nationally organized churches what to think or how to interpret Lutheranism. But it's also depending on the type of Lutheranism, it also leaves it a lot to the individual. That's the whole purpose. Read your Bible and make of it whatever you want. And I guess the Danish version, as it developed, changed a lot in the 19th century, and it was turned from a very top-down organization to a very, very grassroots based organization. So the strictness, which was certainly there in the 17th and 18th century, it sort of went out of the window in the 19th century, together with hell and damnation and a lot of things. So the kind of mainstream Lutheranism that is practiced by the Danish Lutheran Church since the 19th century is actually sort of extremely liberal. It's a little bit kumbaya from time to time, but actually very soft touch. And you know, I've known a lot of Christians who have abandoned Christianity and who come out of it and they're very bitter, they're very angry about the things that they were made to believe or made to do as children. Whereas I got out of Lutheranism, I have no anger. But very, very nice, well-meaning people. I don't believe what they believe, but it's very, very nice, very human-oriented, very gentle. So the strictness of Lutheranism, I'm sure you can find it, but I've never experienced it. Neither in my own life nor in Danish tradition, unless we go back to the 18th century. You can certainly find it there, but not really. Not really since then. So
like going to church when you were young was not a part of your growing up, no?
It wasn't enforced, but my parents did go to church, particularly in the earlier years when I was quite young. What I mostly remember was the music, the hymns. Since I come from a family where music is quite a prevalent thing, Lutheran hymns is very much part of my musical maternal language.
Oh my God. So like, does it mean you can play instruments?
I play the cello, but it's more the cello playing me. It's a difficult instrument, but it's fun, and I sing. I was a very passionate choir singer for many years, and during lockdown, over the years, I've sort of completely lost my voice and haven't really sung for many years. But then during lockdown, a friend of mine who's a trained opera singer, lives in New Jersey.
Oh my God.
She had to move all her teaching online because of the crisis. And she was desperate to get students because some of her students, they didn't want to do it online, or they felt they couldn't afford it and all that. In that situation, I got in. So I'm actually taking weekly lessons by a trained opera singer. It's great fun.
Oh my God.
So at 56, I'm rediscovering my voice.
Brilliant. That's a secret we have learned today about you.
It's actually not a secret. Most of my colleagues know that I'm into that, but that also means that I have a very big heart for music and thinking about music, and also thinking about what is the musical maternal, the musical mother tongue of different people. I find that extremely fascinating. I mean, what would you describe as your musical mother tongue?
So obviously, like Bangladesh had like two very popular poets. I'm not sure whether you know someone called Tagore.
Yeah.
Tagore is very famous. So like so the most of the songs are like hymns as well. So these are like hymns. It's like kind of praising gods and like deities and all those things. Not in a like very religious way. It's like there's a kind of secular sense there. It's like kind of universal. It's like some kind of offering, some kind of sacrifice you're doing. It's beautiful, beautiful songs.
So is it a kind of matching the earthly experience with a kind of spiritual dimension?
So like that book is called actually just offerings. And that book actually got Nobel Prize for literature. So like Tagore actually got Nobel Prize
in 1912, I think.
Yeah, 1913. I think 1913. So like Tagore played a big role in our understanding about music. I mean, he's like so versatile. He was writing lots of novels, lots of short stories. So I was growing up, just like going through this like Tagore process. So that's one big thing. Even like my big sister was a good Tagore singer. So I still remember those days.
And can I just ask, the tunes, they are the ones that Tagore wrote himself?
Yeah. So I mean, Tagore is like one of those like kind of he's just amazingly gifted. I mean, I did a degree on English literature. I never found this kind of resourceful, like such a like it's a like prophet of like literature, poetry. He wrote like obviously songs, musics, poems, novel. He was a painter as well. He's an artist. I mean, it's just unbelievable. This guy is just unbelievably
Yes. Yes.
So like someone from like Calcutta, it's a Bengali family, got Nobel Prize. It's just like unreal in 1913.
Yes, absolutely.
Like Tagore played a big role, but also I was also interested in like the folk music in Bengali. Folk, this is amazing folk music. There's like a bunch of folk singers as well. They're very, very well respected in the society. These are amazing songs. I mean, I still listen to them time to time. It's just always there, the part and parcel of our lives.
So the folk music is also a living tradition where it's constantly added, where folk musicians produce new music in that tradition all the time.
Yeah, and then also it kind of blended with like modern pop music as well. So like they try to blend all kind of stuff, but the pure folk music is still there. These people are still there. These are special people, and they use like very special this instrument. It's just like 2-string instrument. It's beautiful. I mean, I will send you some those folk music.
Oh, I'd love to listen to that.
Just like something just like what's the right word? It's just like you feel like you are in a like nirvana. You feel like this is like nirvana feeling. Because so obviously I went through all those processes in my life, the Western, Eastern, everything, but those things are the permanent feature of my understanding about the music. So those art is very important for me. Even like sometimes I feel that like when I was, because I mean the other day I was watching film with Omar. It's like Fellini's film, the based in like 1950s Italy, the rural family, how the adult boys are pampered by their mother, those kind of things. And I feel that, oh my God, that's like my father's generation, my like uncle's generation. It just perhaps there is a kind of I don't know, like every society has got those things. I mean, and I'm pretty sure like Denmark has got those folk music as well.
Well, can I just say first this sense of seeing a Fellini film and you think, oh yeah, these family structures or these dynamics. That's exactly. Yes, I know that. I think it's very important to have that sensibility that even when you look at films that come from cultures that are quite different from your own, that you see, that's that grandmother matriarch. Yes, that's just like a Danish family. So I think that's that's one of the wonderful things about seeing films that are culturally far away from me, that it's both that things are done differently. There are many things that are different, but there are also the core of it. So much that is instantly recognizable in human terms.
So, like, if I say, you are a historian, if I say that, this planet and the people, I think they have got this like common historical thread there.
Yeah.
And like if I see, even like if I watch something from like South America, their film, their plays, or their, you can see it. Oh my God, that relates to my family as well. It also makes me like very like nostalgic, like when the rise of populism, far right movements, and all those things. It really makes me sad, and so many things to gain from here, because we have got this very common thread, historical root of everyone.
Yeah,
we can actually really love each other, be kind to each other, and then we can all thrive together.
Yes, I share that feeling. I guess it's what I most dislike about the far right, that they ideologically deny what we have in common, and deliberately don't want to see the humanity in the others, or and the dignity in others. And then, of course, it's particularly painful when they are using the same cultural tropes as the ones you grew up with, and suddenly you see them being appropriated for something quite unhelpful and nefarious. And that happens in Denmark these years, as it happens elsewhere. But I'm much more interested, and I know politically this will not happen, but we are so used to thinking in groups and nations and interests, and I'm much more in wherever possible. I try to think about what can be good for humanity. It's very idealistic, but I think collectively we need to move towards thinking about humanity rather than thinking about the interest of, say, Great Britain or Russia or whichever country it is. And I also think about that in relation to, obviously, the migration crisis. There is this underlying assumption that somehow people are unworthy to come into Europe unless they can prove in some way or another that they are worthy according to whatever definition, and that economic migration is somehow a bad thing. No, that is legitimate. That there are some very obvious political, economic reasons why borders may not be open, and things have to be managed. I accept that from a practical point of view, but fundamentally, fundamentally, for me, everybody trying to move from one place or another is legitimate. It may not be viable. It may not be, politically I know there will be put barriers in place. But I can't think of it in any other way as fundamentally illegitimate, a legitimate thing to do. People go where they see their future, and that is not in itself illegitimate. I know what I'm saying it sounds very vague, but what I'm trying to get at is this whole idea of people not being worthy to come to the West, and I just fundamentally cannot accept that premise, or the premise that Denmark belongs to Danes, and that somehow only the real Danes with the real credentials have the right to determine who should be within the border of Denmark. But as you know, this is a very big discussion, and I simply mention that because I much rather think about humanity and the interest of humanity. If I were to sort of think at a very idealistic level.
No, I mean that makes sense. I mean, thank you. And yeah, like one of the things, like, because that was a quite, deep discussion, and then like lighter thing. I mean, because you are talking about the Danes, like, I mean, I know like there are like Vikings there as well. So like, can you give us more insight about this, like Danes, Vikings, like how are they the same people or different? Like what kind of thing?
The Vikings are not an ethnicity. The Vikings were, when we talk about Vikings and we talk about Viking culture, we're talking about the elites of Scandinavian societies between the 8th century up to the mid 11th century. Basically, we say 1066 and all that. When the Danes lost influence in England, that's typically when we put the ending point for the Viking age. But it's not an ethnicity. It's simply an elite culture. The small farmers and the thralls, the slaves, they were not Vikings. They were not. They were just peasants and thralls. But these elites, these elite warriors, robbers, thugs, whatever we call them, were moving quite freely between the Danes and the Swedes and the Norwegians. And at the tip of my tongue, I'm almost saying, well, there were the Juts and the Danes and the Gotha and the Svea, and there were a number of different tribes. Tribes and dynasties in endless coalitions with each other, and then they fell out with each other, and then they got back together again, and then they fell out again. It's an endless story of betrayals and coalitions and re-betrayal. Very, very unstable elite connections. And they were thugs towards anyone outside that culture, but they were also thugs inside. I mean, they were really not nice people.
Because, like, I mean, when you started talking about Vikings, the first thing I thought, are they like kind of like gladiators? The way we see like gladiators, this elite, soldiers, the fighters.
But the gladiators were, after all, they were slaves, and they fought for a spectacle. The Vikings didn't. The Vikings, that was everything from the king to the kings to the grandees of, we didn't call them nobility at the time, but the grandees and their retinue, whoever was within that circle, and of course their wives and children, and they were part of that Viking segment of society. But
because like, I mean, one of the things I know that like Netflix has got a very popular show called Vikings. Do you recommend to watch it?
I don't know. I don't know. Since I haven't seen it. But whenever people start glorifying Vikings, I always get nervous tics, because it's often for very obvious reasons appropriated by the far right, because it was such a violent culture. And it was so, it was a culture that glorified violence. It was a culture that was extremely uber-masculine. So basically anything goes, and the strongest prevail. There was
but at the same time, I'm just like, I mean, so there's nothing to do with like Christianity. It looks like almost like pagan.
Well, it was pagan. It was pre-Christian. But it comes at a time when Christianity is beginning to insert itself. And Christianity exists very awkwardly, increasingly, alongside this Viking culture, with the Christian monks desperately trying to tame these guys with greater or smaller success. But there's also sort of a hybrid form of Christianity during this period, where they somehow manage to insert Christianity at some levels into this extremely violent culture. Now, 6 months ago, when I went to Orkney, I read the Orkney Inga saga, which talks about the Earls of Orkney from the 10th to the 12th century. That was revealing for several reasons, because, as I said, we normally put 1066 as the end of the Viking Age, but here these guys, into the end of the 12th century, they were still Vikings, very clearly Vikings. Wow. But they were Christians. And there are these, they are constantly raiding each other, and they are raiding the Scottish coast. And at some point, there's a group of these Christian Vikings, including the local bishop, are going to the Holy Land, going to Jerusalem. And they are looting and pillaging all the way to Jerusalem, alongside the bishop. He's part of it all along. In the Mediterranean, they hijack, or they attack ship and takes everything. And they decide, well, if they're Christians, we will let them live, and if they're Muslims, we'll kill them. But they're going to be looted. It is wild, and it is incredibly thuggish. So eventually, they sort of settled down, and by the 12th century in Denmark and Sweden, they had calmed down. They were no longer Vikings, but clearly on Orkney, they are at it big time. So obviously that kind of culture and that kind of mindset is just fits very well into a certain mentality on the far right, and I think it says more about the people who appropriate it.
Because I mean, they think that that's their golden age, isn't it?
You say that the golden age of Denmark?
Yeah. Like for the far right, the Vikings.
Yeah, for them, of course, yes. I mean, if you're far right, yes. But I don't know how much the far right is interested in the actual history. But they can sort of appropriate the mentality and the symbolism and you know, also the pre-Christian gods. I don't know if you have seen. There is a very popular series. I haven't seen it, but where Thor and Loki are the great heroes. As far as I can see, it's not particularly nefarious, but you know, Loki, who is a great hero. Whereas in Norse mythology, Loki is the guy nobody likes. He's totally unreliable, and he's the great traitor of everybody. But here, in this series, he's become really cool.
Yeah, because it was acted by a very cool actor as well.
Yes. Yes, and he does appear very cool in the bits that I have seen, and you know, this is very innocent, but we just shouldn't take it for being the sort of 10th century reality. But there's nothing. I mean, there's nothing to hail as positive or civilized about the Vikings. No.
Oh. Good.
They were great. They were great boat builders. They had the Lamborghini boat of that period. But that's as much as we can say about them. And I find reading the stories, the sagas that were written down in the 12th century on Iceland, I find it a fascinating window into that world, into that mentality. My God, it's a brutal world, very brutal.